Hey everybody, hello and welcome to this CBT Nuggets webinar, Separating Azure from the Cloud Pack with Ben Finkel. Before I hand things off to Ben, I'm just going to quickly remind you all that the chat pod is available to you to ask any questions you might have during the webinar. And Ben's going to do his best to answer some of those at the end of his presentation. I also want to let you guys all know that there's going to be a recording posted to our blog, blog.cbtnuggets.com, in the next couple of days. But from there, that's all I've got. Ben, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thanks, Anthony. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So like he said, this is Separating Azure from the Cloud Pack, and I am Ben Finkel. A little bit of background. I've been doing this job for 18 years. I mean, not this job exactly, but I've been doing IT work, support, software engineering, software architecture for a long, long time. And to give you some perspective, 18 years ago, Windows 95 was the latest and greatest operating system, and we weren't sure if the internet was going to be a fad or not. So a lot has happened over the years, but I don't think that anything, at least that I've seen in terms of change and development and evolution in the IT industry, has been as tectonic, has been as huge a shift as the shift that we've seen over the past 3 or so years into cloud services. And there is, you can tell because there's just so many different vendors entering this market, entering this marketplace. Cloud services are a big deal. You've got Microsoft, you've got Google, you've got Amazon, you've got IBM, Rackspace, the list goes on and on and on. And you need to know how to use some of the cloud in order to be relevant, in order for your skills to be up to date, in order to be employable in today's marketplace. It's just simply a fact of life now. But it can be really confusing because there are so many different offerings out there. There are so many different providers, and they overlap in so many different ways that you're probably, if you're not really prepared to come into the cloud with a plan, you're probably scratching your head a little bit and saying, well, what am I going to do here? How am I doing this? So what we want to talk about in this presentation, in this webinar, is Microsoft Azure. That's the cloud service offering from Microsoft, and how it separates itself, what makes it a little bit different from its providers. And I want to start off by talking a little bit about what Microsoft Azure is in general. I think most of you here probably have an idea of what Microsoft Azure is, but it will be helpful to sort of level set and understand what we're talking about here. So Microsoft Azure, like a lot of the different providers out there, has some basic public cloud service offerings. And when I say public cloud, I'm talking about offerings that are available on the internet for anyone in the public to use. You're talking about shared storage environments where they've built these huge infrastructures that you are able to simply buy or lease a portion of in order to run your application, in order to service your solution, your product. And some of the things that they have in Microsoft Azure, they've got Azure Websites, which is Microsoft's platform as a service, they call that. And by the way, this is how fast this stuff moves. It's no longer even called Azure Websites. I think it's now called Azure Web Apps. But Azure Websites are a platform as a service, and this is where you get an entire platform, virtual machines with software installed, up-to-date, security updates applied, web hosting software running for you, all available, pre-built, pre-packaged, deployable with a single click so that you can simply build applications and deploy them out into that platform. You've also got Azure VMs, and that's part of their infrastructure as a service offering. PaaS and IaaS are a couple of acronyms that you see come up a lot in the cloud. And Azure VMs, Azure Virtual Machines, are just like they sound like. Those are virtual machines that you can spin up, and then you have control over what is on those virtual machines. So those are the infrastructure. The actual machines that are hosting those virtual servers is provided to you as a service by Microsoft. But you've got the control over what goes on those virtual machines, what software is running on them, are they up to date, what kind of libraries, anything that you can imagine that you want to install on a virtual machine that's going to run on a Hyper-V environment, you can get inside of that infrastructure as a service. They've also got Azure SQL, which is, like you might guess, a database as a service. That's an SQL database that you can spin up and you can run, and multiple SQL databases if you need to create a cluster of databases. And that gives you relational data storage, again, inside of the cloud. Storage, Azure Storage is your storage as a service option. So that's when you need not data storage, not relational data storage, but you need blob storage, binary storage, Azure Files, Azure Tables. These are different ways to store large amounts of relatively unstructured data in the cloud. And all of these things come with the sort of promises of public cloud services. This is what public cloud really does for us, and this is why we want it, and that is scalability availability and accessibility, right? So scalability, we mean that you can spin up larger, bigger, stronger implementations of your product to handle bigger, stronger requests, right? As your traffic increases, you create the next cool application, the next Snapchat, the next Instagram. Suddenly overnight you need to handle way more traffic than you used to be handling. Well, that's what cloud scalability allows you to do. You can scale up and, just as importantly, I think, scale down the amount of resources that are available to you. Availability, this is obviously very, very important. Again, you need your services to be available, and one of the promises of the public cloud is that your implementation, your solutions will be always available. I think Microsoft Azure has over 99% uptime on pretty much every one of their services. Some of them are even like 99.95%, which is great, right? I mean, that's really available, super strong, super powerful stuff. And then global accessibility. This is the idea that anyone, anywhere in the globe can get access to your stuff. And in fact, you can push your stuff out to the globe, different data centers around the entire world. So scalability, availability, and accessibility. Those are kind of the pillars, I think, of cloud service offerings. But these are things that I just talked about that a lot of vendors have. You're not really separating yourself from Amazon Web Services or from Rackspace or from IBM necessarily with these items. So how does Microsoft Azure separate itself away from the pack? First, I think it does so with features. And I'm going to go over three actually different ways here that I think it separates itself. Three kind of general headings for these ideas. Number one, features. Features, features, features. Microsoft Azure has a ton of them. So I just talked about four kind of general features that they have right there, but that's only the beginning. If we look at their platform as a service, yes, they have websites or web apps, but they've also got mobile services. They have their API apps. API apps is a visual way for you to build globally accessible APIs inside of the public cloud. They've got their notification hub inside of the platform as a service to create cool messaging. The infrastructure as a service. Yes, there are virtual machines. You need virtual machines. Everyone does in order to operate again in IT today. But they've got so many more things. They've got Azure Batch available to you. They have Azure Cloud Services, which are like half of an IaaS and half of a PaaS. So they have all these different features in between, in the nooks and crannies, that expand on the general sort of features that you might expect inside of the cloud service offering. Storage and database options. Yeah, you know what? They've got Azure Storage. They have Azure SQL Database. They've also got Azure Document DB. That's a NoSQL document-based database service inside of the cloud that, again, you can scale up and create available for all of your products. Redis Cache, which is an implementation of an in-memory, a super low latency, high availability in-memory caching service that you can use in front of any of your Microsoft Azure products. Store Simple, which is a way, and this is real important also, a way to hybrid join your storage in the cloud with your local on-premise storage. So hybrid clouds are another big thing we're going to talk about in a minute. Keep that one in mind, Store Simple. Analytics, I think this is maybe the coolest stuff in the cloud, period. This is the kind of thing that used to only be available, and relatively recently, was only available to people who had a lot of resources, a lot of capital to throw at a big, wide infrastructure. And that meant that things like analyzing large data sets were not available to most people. Well, almost overnight, that's completely changed. And with Microsoft Azure's analytics tools, you have relatively cheaply and efficiently, you have the ability to crunch these huge data sets, to run these awesome analytics tools against large data sets. And you can do so without having to invest an enormous amount in your infrastructure. HD Insight, which is Hadoop clusters that allow you to deal with Hadoop data. Machine learning for predictive analytics, stream analytics, event hubs. These things allow you to do really incredible stuff with all of the data that we're collecting these days. Then on top of that, there's all the other things that you get when you talk about Microsoft Azure. There's just so many of them. There's media and CDN options, right? So you can push images and video out into content delivery networks, get those out in the globe around the world so that they are close to the people who want to download that data. They have a whole new Internet of Things initiative that's bundling up some of these things and making them available for the new Internet of Things, which is probably a buzzword you've heard a lot about. And they've got identity management. This is another important hybrid one, Azure Active Directory, which is kind of the world leader, Active Directory in identity management around networks around the world. So it does these things, and it does all these things again while maintaining that promise, standing on the pillars of those 3 cloud services: scalability, availability, and accessibility. And I'm actually really proud of myself for finding a way to make those kind of alliterate through. Scalability, availability, accessibility. Those are 3 important things, and they are carried throughout all of these different features. So I think that's one way that Azure really separates itself, particularly from some of the other offerings like, say, IBM or Rackspace. You're not going to get this wealth of features with those vendors, with those providers. Azure really stands out in this regard. The second one, and I just mentioned this a few moments ago, that I think makes Microsoft Azure a big deal, is that it's hybrid ready. So hybrid cloud is a new thing, and when people talk about the hybrid cloud, they're talking about combining these public cloud services that I was just talking about with a local on-premise data center. Because if your company's more than a few years old, you probably started with a local on-premise data center. You've got a lot of things already running inside of your local on-premise center. You want to migrate into the cloud. You need to find a way to do that without bending over backwards or without shutting your operation down for weeks on end. Well, hybrid cloud is all about that. It's about running some of your stuff locally, some of your stuff in the cloud, and slowly moving your products and your solutions into the cloud. So what makes Microsoft Azure great for this? Well, for starters, it runs on Microsoft Windows. And I know Microsoft is not all that hip. It's not the coolest thing these days, right? Everyone likes the open source stuff. But the simple fact of the matter is Microsoft Windows runs a lot of business, not just here in America, but around the entire globe. It's a very popular implementation, and that means that your Microsoft Azure Cloud implementations, which also runs on Microsoft Windows, are going to integrate very cleanly with your Microsoft Windows on-premise solutions. So that makes the hybrid option very easy and very straightforward to do. Now you've also got things like BizTalk and Service Bus and even Site Recovery. These are tools built into Microsoft Azure that are expressly designed for setting up a hybrid solution. So your BizTalk services can actually create a live notification and messaging stream between your on-premise solution and your Microsoft Azure solution. Service Bus, same kind of thing. It makes sure that you've got communication constantly being updated between these two implementations, on-premise and in the cloud. Site Recovery, really, really cool. Site Recovery allows you to install agents in your local on-premise data center that back up and create failover systems inside of Microsoft Azure for you. So really, with very little work, you've created a whole failover disaster recovery scenario in the cloud, and that's allowed to happen because, again, the Microsoft connection. They're able to make sure that what you're working on is going to work. Azure Active Directory, that's another one that I just mentioned a few moments ago. Most places around the world are using Active Directory for their what they call identity management, right? That's how your domain controller works. You log into Active Directory, and that determines who you are and what you have access to and what you don't have access to. Well, Azure Active Directory is just an Active Directory in the cloud. And yes, that's right. When you have an Active Directory in the cloud, you can hook it up to your local Active Directory. You can federate out all of your identity management into that cloud operation and very easily create a hybrid on-premise in the cloud solution for your identity management solutions. Office 365, you might have heard of that. That's the cloud-based version of the Office products that everybody knows and loves and uses. Again, Microsoft's not all that cool, but everyone's using Excel. Everyone's using Microsoft Word. This is commonplace and very, very prevalent around the industry. Office 365 allows you to share your Office documentation, your productivity software, throughout the entire cloud, and again, really enables this idea of hybrid cloud. And once again, it does all this with scalability, availability, and accessibility. I wanted to leave those 3 pillars there down on the bottom of the slide so that we can remember those. Now the third way that I think Microsoft Azure separates itself is with its reliance and its use on familiar tools. So this kind of ties back into what we were just talking about a little bit. For starters, you're using Microsoft Windows, right? Microsoft Windows, again, is very common. Most of us have Microsoft Windows on our desktops at home, our laptops. We've been using it for years and years and years. Microsoft Azure allows us to continue to use that operating system that we are all so familiar with. We also get to use, though, a lot of other familiar development tools, things like Visual Studio, because Microsoft owns Visual Studio. Visual Studio is one of the most popular development environments out there right now. Because they own Visual Studio, they have integrated libraries into Visual Studio that allow you to work with Microsoft Azure really seamlessly, really cleanly. The migration for me personally, and I have a background in development, moving into Microsoft Azure with Visual Studio makes it so seamless and so easy that really you almost don't notice. It's tough to tell that you've moved into a cloud-based environment because you're simply developing your code locally in Visual Studio and deploying it out into Microsoft Azure. Now, another real popular tool that Microsoft produces is PowerShell. That's their scripting language. And guess what? You can use PowerShell to do just about everything in Microsoft Azure. So if you're familiar with PowerShell, and a lot of you probably are, it's a very popular scripting language, you're going to know how to use Microsoft PowerShell to work with Microsoft Azure. And again, that transition is going to be very easy. It's going to be very familiar, and it's not going to be the big leap that you might have when you go into another cloud service that has its own tools and its own language. And lastly, you've got command line tools. So a lot of us are used to working simply with command line operations, DOS, batch scripts, etc. Well, you can use those as well. They're there and available, and you can always get command line tools, plus a whole host of other things. I threw a GitHub logo on here because that's one of the ones that they work with. I think most of us are familiar with GitHub. You can integrate GitHub directly into Microsoft Azure. You can integrate Team Foundation Server directly into Microsoft Azure. All kinds of different things that you're familiar with, that you are used to using, are going to work inside of Microsoft Azure. So it's a very familiar, a very easy kind of transition process from traditional local development into cloud development. The last thing here, I know I said that I had 3 points, but you know what? Bonus features. Hey, everybody loves a bonus. So just a couple of extra features that don't necessarily separate Microsoft entirely from its competitors, but I think they're important bonus features. They're important things to know about and to talk about. And the first one is that Microsoft Azure is very open source friendly. I think this surprises a lot of people. Microsoft has a reputation and a tradition of not being very, friendly, I guess, like I said there, with the open source community. Well, whoever the team is in charge of Azure, they are not that part of Microsoft. They are embracing the open source movement with just open arms. It is really, really easy to get up and running with open source tools inside of Azure. And I'm talking about operating systems for your virtual machines. They have a ton of different Linux images, Debian, SUSE, Ubuntu. They've got click to deploy options from MongoDB and MySQL. You can use Chef and Puppet to manage the configuration of those things. They've even recently, I think, integrated with Docker. So if you're into containers, you know, I know that's a real big deal right now and a real cool big thing that's happening. You can get Docker containers running on your Windows virtual machines inside of Microsoft Azure. Another really important point, I think, is that they are secure and compliant. So we're talking ISO, PCI, HIPAA, SOC 1 and 2. One of the big problems, and I'll admit, you know, this was the first time I came across Microsoft Azure. I was working in the medical industry. I wanted to move on to Azure, and I was at a seminar, a conference, and I raised my hand and I said, well, what about HIPAA compliance? And the guy just kind of looked at me like I was, you know, had my head screwed on backwards. This was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. That's a big deal, right? You can't use it if it's not compliant, if it doesn't meet the regulatory requirements of your particular industry, your particular business. Well, now they do. And whether that is finance, whether that is Sarbanes-Oxley, whether that is HIPAA, protected health information, you know that your data going into Microsoft Azure is secure and that it is compliant with the requirements of those laws and those regulations. And that's true both here in the United States as well as some different places around the globe, like the UK G-Cloud initiative. So all of these things combine, I think, to make Azure a really robust offering inside of the cloud service market. There's a reason I think that it's growing so much and it's become so popular. And these are really the reasons that I think do it. Microsoft has put a ton of money into expanding it, making it a really great, interesting public cloud service offering. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you guys and ask you guys, what kind of questions do you have? What do you want to know about Microsoft Azure? What is confusing you about it? What would you like to learn about it? Lay it on us, and let's hear what you got. And I think, just to repeat, Anthony, if I get this right, if you type in your questions in the chat window, they'll get up to me here, and I'll be able to answer them for you.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so here's one. Can we do encryption through the cloud using PGP or other encryption tools? So that's a great question. You're sending your data out into the cloud, and you want to know, is it going to be safe, and are you able to use it? The short answer is yes, it is. You can integrate always with HTTPS and SSL in order to encrypt your data as it translates over the internet. You're doing almost all of your communication with these cloud services over the HTTP protocol. So SSL is where that's going to happen. In terms of your data being encrypted at rest in Microsoft Azure services, you do need to implement a third-party solution of your choosing. Something like BitLocker is what they recommend. But if you're on a Linux environment, Linux machines, you may need to use your own encryption tools in order to do that. So it is it's important to know that you can do these things. You got to implement it a little bit on your own. Some of the SSL stuff is implemented for you. Some of it you actually need to get in there and configure yourself. And I think the follow-up question there, can you host a VM with PGP server and encrypt clients? You absolutely can. With Azure VMs, you can host whatever VM server you want, and as long as you punch the right holes through their firewalls, you can host that communication, you can host that traffic, as long as, again, you've set up that PGP server. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if you go into the Azure Marketplace, I wouldn't be surprised if they have a click-to-deploy option for something like that. Does Microsoft plan to support VMware? Not to my knowledge. They run on Hyper-V, and they do have some basic VMware support in their site recovery options. So you can actually install your site recovery client on a VMware machine, and you can recover VMware machines, fail them over into the cloud. But everything inside of Microsoft Azure is running on Hyper-V. That seems to be about the extent of the VMware compliance or support that they have planned right now. Now, I'm not privy to all the inside information. There may be more going on there, but that's what I know of right now. AWS, okay, so here's one. AWS seems to have a giant lead over Azure. Wouldn't it be better to learn AWS rather than Azure? That's also a good question, and I kind of love questions like that because, first of all, a few years ago, iOS had a great lead over Android, and you would have said, well, shouldn't I learn iOS and not Android? And you know what, just a few years later, that turns out not to be true. Should you learn AWS over Azure? A lot of that, I think, depends on you. Yes, AWS has a much broader implementation right now. A lot more people using AWS than are using Microsoft Azure. But on the flip side, and we've been doing some research right in-house at CBT Nuggets on this, Azure is growing at a much, much faster rate than AWS. So Azure has been slowly chewing away and has really landed itself solidly in that second spot behind AWS. AWS is Amazon Web Services, by the way, if I didn't say that for those listening. So Azure is growing and becoming more and more popular. Also, if you already have a job, if you're already at a Microsoft shop, you want to learn Azure probably. You're probably going to make that shift into Azure as opposed to AWS. So that's another reason. But the basic question, yes, AWS has a much broader share of the market right now. Which one makes more sense to learn? I don't know. That depends on a lot of factors. For me, I would do my best to learn both. That's certainly where I think the value lies. You got to be really flexible in the cloud if you're going to use it. So I hope that answers that question there. Can I use SharePoint on Azure? Absolutely, you can. In fact, they do, and I know this for a fact. They have click-to-deploy options for SharePoint on Microsoft Azure VMware, or Microsoft Azure VM servers. So you can literally spin up an Azure account, click a button, it's going to walk you through a configuration wizard, and a few minutes later you'll have a SharePoint server running inside of Microsoft Azure. Another CBT trainer here, Brian Alderman, is doing a presentation on exactly that topic. Either this week or next. I forgot when that's coming up. So yeah, absolutely. SharePoint and Microsoft Azure is great. It's exactly the kind of thing that I think separates Azure from some of its competitors, is the ability to spin up a really common, popular utility like SharePoint inside of Azure so quickly. Can you use Azure for AD failover when SSO is set up? Yes, I believe so. You can set up a very easy hybrid connection between your on-premise AD server, Active Directory, is what I assume we're talking about there with AD, and you can hook that up to the Azure Active Directory inside of the cloud, and that would mean that you can use it as a failover utility. If your Active Directory goes down for whatever reason, your local on-premise servers go down, you can absolutely fail over into the cloud-based Azure Active Directory, and you've still got your identity management services up and running. Your whole operation is not brought down because of your Active Directory. Wow, a lot of questions coming in. This is good, guys. Thanks. This is awesome. If we have web servers with different data center locations, can they connect to databases hosted at a different data center? And if so, are the pipes between data centers high performance? So the question here is about the fact that you might have your web servers hosted in one data center, your database is hosted in another data center, and what's the connection, what's the latency, the performance look like between those data centers? So the short version of that answer is yes, you can do that, absolutely. You can really set up quite a broad range of geographic locations for your different pieces, your different components. Just because things belong in what Azure calls a resource group doesn't mean that they have to be located in the same physical geographic region. In fact, separating geographic regions is one of the ways that you get that high availability, that middle pillar there that I talked about. So the short answer is yes, you can. You are going to, of course, introduce more latency in that regard than if they were in the same data center, right? It's got to cross geographic location. It's going to be slower than if they were in the same building together. But Microsoft, being the gigantic organization that they are, the huge, global consuming company that they are, they have ownership of a lot of direct fiber pipes between their data centers. And you'll find that transmitting data between those centers over those pipes is a lot faster than if it were going over the public internet. And not to call out other vendors, because all these different products are great really in the cloud, but that is one place where Amazon is not able to keep up in the sense that its data centers have to communicate over shared public use pipes, shared public use lines, whereas a larger organization like Microsoft can create its own private leased lines and get a really strong bandwidth, really high bandwidth between its data centers. Here's the next question here, and I'm just pulling these off the list, guys. We have an existing virtualized infrastructure, servers, desktop storage. Can we move the entire VMware hosted environment onto the Azure platform in order to get it off-site? Yes, absolutely you can. I think that's going back to that hybrid feature that I talked about. It's really, really easy to migrate and move from an existing, particularly an existing VMware or Hyper-V installation into the cloud, into Microsoft Azure Cloud. So site recovery is a big part of that. And I call it site recovery, but that's actually the name of the product, Azure Site Recovery. You go ahead and Google that and look that up and read the documentation. But that will actually fail over from your existing VMware servers into Microsoft Azure Cloud. So you can copy, you can migrate them all up. You can also export your VMware installations to virtual hard disks, VHDs, upload them into Microsoft Azure and get them spin up and running inside of Microsoft Azure. And you'll find that's very easy, very simple and straightforward to do. Azure has a lot of different tools and utilities to help you do that. That's a big, big selling point, I think, for Microsoft Azure. All right, here's one. This is a bit of a long one here. I recently set up a direct backup to Azure using the Azure Backup Client. Great, that's a part of the site recovery, the backup client. However, I found the client to have a lot of bugs and never fully complete. Have you experienced any issues using the Azure Backup Client? I have not, to answer this question. Tough to get into troubleshooting questions like that on a webinar like this. This is probably a good point to mention that one of the downsides or one of the dark, seedy underbelly of moving to the cloud is that a lot of these cloud products are new and they are not always well tested. They don't always work well. I had found that Microsoft Azure support is really exceptional. It's really, really good. And you can reach out to their support line either through phone or through email. There's even live chat options. And they have absolutely been incredibly helpful in understanding this stuff. There's also a relatively good community for Microsoft Azure support. You'll actually find that on stackoverflow.com. There's really helpful people out there who are dealing with these problems, probably dealt with them in the past and answering them. And I think you get a lot of good answers. So my direct answer to that question would be I have not, but I've not used Azure Backup outside of really just a kind of sterile test environment. So I would by all means recommend contacting Azure support, get involved in the community on Stack Overflow, and I think you'll find some good answers. It is 1:30, Anthony. There's a few more. Should I go, or do you want to take these down and respond to them later?
You've probably got like a couple more minutes if you want to try and get a couple.
All right. So next question off the top here, learning any cloud technology shifts administration to a broader field. Where should one start? So this is a good point as well, and I think this ties back into, you might have heard the phrase DevOps come up. So when you move into the cloud, you're necessarily going to have to learn some stuff that you probably didn't know before. In the traditional kind of setups, you had developers who were only focused on developing software. You had systems engineers who are only focused on system stuff. But now that you're in the cloud, you kind of need to know a little bit about both. If you're a developer, you may have to be spinning up virtual machines. You may have to be learning a little bit about virtual networking in order to make your systems work properly. If you're an operations guy, if you're an engineer, you may have to learn a little bit about development, a little bit about scripting. It's actually what Chef and Puppet on the screen there are all about. Those are scripting, basically taking a programming approach to configuring machines. So where does one start? Well, I think one starts where you're strong. For me, that certainly has been my easiest leverage into it. So I have a history as a developer, networking, engineering infrastructure. That's not really my strong suit. That's never been my bag. I've done a little bit of it. But with a history as a developer, I have started with Azure websites. I have started with AWS Elastic Beanstalk. I've started with Google App Engine. These are developer-centric, developer-focused tools that are intended to introduce you into the cloud products. They are the platform as a service tools, PaaS. I think those are probably the best ways to start. If you're coming from the other end, start with the other things. If virtual machines are something that you know and you love and you're comfortable working with, start with Azure VMs. You're going to be very familiar with what you're doing there, and you'll be able to slowly branch out from there into the other topics. A couple other questions here. What is the service level agreement uptime on Azure? That depends on the product. The lowest SLA that I've seen on a product is 99.5% uptime. There are a couple of scenarios where you get 99.95% uptime. So it's very, very high. You do need to ensure that you are using the service correctly, and in all the documentation they generally identify this, that if you want to guarantee that 99.5% uptime, you have to make sure that you have this or that you have this set on. You configure things, according to some certain sort of general loose rules, but as long as you do that, you will get a very, very high SLA with Microsoft Azure. All right, last question here. I'm just going to go, Anthony, and then you can finish this up. To provide remote users a better end-user experience, are you able to share your existing on-premise SQL DB with remote users by creating a copy in the Azure Cloud Platform? Yes, absolutely you are. You can replicate. This is really cool because, again, you're using SQL Server. It's also SQL Server in the cloud. Microsoft Azure solution is also SQL Server. So you can replicate your SQL Server out into these cloud SQL Server databases, and that will ensure you can have them anywhere in the globe, anywhere Microsoft has a data center, you can push your databases out to. And once you've done that, you've got a copy of your data closer to your end users. That's the third pillar that we've been talking about here in the cloud, global accessibility. Because they have these things scattered all around the world, you can push copies of that data out to those places, and your users are going to get a lower latency, higher throughput connection to the data that they need to read. All right, I think that got through all of the questions there. So with that, I will say thanks everyone for listening to me ramble on. Always excited to do these webinars. And Anthony, I'll turn it back over to you.
All righty, awesome. Thanks everyone. Those are some great questions. Ben, that was an awesome presentation. Thanks again guys for joining us today. Just going to remind you one last time that we'll be posting a recording of this webinar to blog.cbtnuggets.com. Have a great rest of your week.